Right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Malcolm Pinkerton. I'm a senior analyst at Verdict Research, and that's going to give you a very brief overview today of UK DIY retailing in 2011 and looking forward to 2014. So just going to give a brief overview. I'm going to look at some of the issues for retail over the next few years. Then I'm going to look at UK retail growth until 2014. Then looking more specifically at the DIY and gardening market. And then looking at the DIY market in itself. And then looking at some of the strategies for success within that market. And then I'm going to bring it all together for you as well. So firstly, what are some of the issues that retail is facing over the next few years? Well, the first one really is to do with the fact that we're still pretty much in very, very tough economic times. We've got very, very weak GDP. We've also got global demand, which is increasing, and we're increasing at an alarming rate. And that's putting a huge amount of pressure on commodity prices, and that's putting a huge, well, I suppose, pressure on shelf prices. So higher supply chain costs is actually going to bring price inflation, which is not a very good thing at the moment. But the worst really is actually yet to come for the consumer. Last year we had a pretty tough time, but this year we're seeing public sector cuts, which are really going to start to impact consumer spending even more than it have done in the past. We also have unemployment continuing to rise. It's already very, very high levels, but there's still some pressures coming through. And we have the VAT rise, which on top of other high taxes and high inflation is going to basically cause very weak consumer confidence and going to impact levels of demand. There's some other wider sort of trends that we're seeing, of course. We have an ageing population in the UK. And we also have a greater focus on ethics and ethical products. And a lot of that's to do with corporate social responsibility and also provenance, and that's with the local sourcing of food in particular. So that's really changing the nature of demand. It's changing the way the consumer is feeling and the way the consumer is behaving. But we also have, looking at retail, we have quite a lot of space saturation in this country. And we also have a shift online. So those two things are not really working very well together. You have to make that space work a lot harder. But we're also seeing is quite a lot of space polarization. By that we mean we have neighborhood locations, for example, doing particularly well because of the demand for convenience and top-up shopping. We have town centres doing well with premium space, but that's creating a glut of secondary space which no one really wants. While out of town is doing well because of that destination status of those sites. But essentially what we have is overcapacity and that space cannibalization, which is making retailers have to make that space work harder. But all of this together really means that retailers' costs are increasing, but demand is tightening. So margins are really, really under pressure. So we actually started to look at some of these pressures that we're having from the consumer and actually break it down to the age groups. Of course, it's going to impact them in different ways. The younger consumer is probably not your core DIY customer maybe, but they've got higher education fees and now have to pay an awful lot more. Unemployment in that age bracket is also increasing, and their main source of funding is really the bank of mum and dad. And of course, if that is really drying up as a pipeline of funding, then of course their spending is going to be constrained. If we now to the next age bracket, well, they're paying off their student loans and paying it off at a higher rate because of inflation is going up and the RPI has gone up. Trying to get on the property ladder is getting much harder for them, unaffordable housing. And also the levels of unemployment, again, they're all very, very, very high. We have the next age bracket, those family life stage guys. They've got a squeeze in household budgets. They're seeing their wage growth slowing, they're seeing cost of living increasing. And again, the falling housing market there, so that sense of wealth, that sense of financial well-being is actually being eroded. The next stage up, well, they've got education fees quite often. They've got that shrinking savings, and the savings rate is lower. So again, their wealth is being eroded quite sharply. And again, like their younger counterparts, that falling housing market, they might not have as much money as they want to in their property for mortgage equity withdrawal, which also constrains their spending quite dramatically. And then we have the older generation, of which there are now quite a few, and that pension squeeze is actually really beginning to erode their income, and their spending ability is very much dependent on that saving and on their pensions. So all that together really means that really there's a massive squeeze on consumer spend, and it really is beginning to impact demand. It's far more frugal and considered spending from consumers. So we actually look at retail growth over the next few years. Between 2010 and 2014, the overall retail market in the UK is going to grow by £29 billion. And it sounds a lot, but it's not a huge amount when you're considering it's spread across the sort of 9 sectors. And most of that's really going to be driven by food, where a lot of inflation is coming through, and actually in fashion. So it's the home-related spend that's going to be really under pressure. In fact, if you look at the average annual growth over the next, until 2014, it's only going to come in at 2.3% a year. That's a tiny amount when you think about how much it's been growing through historically. Last year, we saw the consumer come under huge pressures with only that 1.5% growth. This year, we're seeing a 2% growth, and again, that's still only very, very small. But as confidence starts to return to the market and consumers get a bit of a sense of well-being and a sense of financial well-being, we can see that growth is only going to really start hitting 2.9%. So still very, very, very subdued in a very constrained consumer environment. So we can now look at the DIY and gardening market separately. In 2004, the whole market was worth, we estimated at Verdict, about £13.4 billion. But between then and 2010, the market fell by 5.6%. And that's quite a dramatic drop-off. But what we saw during that period is that the consumer affiliation with DIY in particular started to wane. That sort of home improvement shows always started to dwindle away, and consumers' affiliation started to dwindle. But we also, during that time, obviously we had the impact of the recession and the impact of spending priorities simply going elsewhere and not investing in the home, especially as the housing market became very, 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 stagnant at best, and prices really, really dropped. Over the next few years, up until 2014, the market's only going to grow by 1.3%. So it's not even going to even recover back to the 2004 levels. So the market really is heading and still in very, very, very tough times. In fact, if you look at the average growth, it's going to be 0.3% for DIY and gardening. And that's, if you look at the 2010, again, you saw that the major impact. In 2011, we're seeing it's still at marginal, pretty to die. It's only going to be 2012, 2013 that we're going to start seeing some proper growth coming through. But if actually looking at which elements of the market are actually underperforming and outperforming, and we can see actually over the next few years, it's actually going to be gardening. That's going to be the real engine of growth. And it's going to be really blossoming compared to the pretty dreadful time that DIY is going to continue to have over that period. But it's actually interesting to see what are the drivers of that. What's actually causing DIY to have such a bad time? Well, it is suffering. It's suffering from that constrained consumer. Consumers just simply haven't got the money to spend on sort of non-discretionary spending, in particular those related to the housing market, because that spend is simply not a priority, especially when your house has lost value or even not really going to increase in value. But we've also got consumers that are not willing or able to make major purchases. They're not naturally thinking, but that is not where that spending priority is resting at the moment. And it's one that can be very easily cut out. But as I alluded to earlier, consumers aren't so excited or interested about do it yourself. They are more interested about get someone in. And competition is intensifying dramatically. You've got more and more players, particularly the grocers and the general merchandisers, beginning to get into DIY. Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, they've all got quite comprehensive core DIY products now. And Asda and Tesco in particular are using their direct offers to actually offer a very cheap alternative to the big box players. In gardening, gardening is blossoming. It's benefiting from numerous trends which are now becoming more and more and more impactful. Aging population is one of them. Aging population is beginning to really influence how that market is performing. Sustainability, we have more of an ethical consumer, and that's all to do with grow your own. There's that sustainability that comes back down to that food provenance, growing your own veg to try and save and reduce your costs. It's also greater use of the garden. We're having people staycations and people using the gardens more as another room. It's a space to entertain. And the weather has got better, which helps that trend even more. Gardening as a leisure activity has become a cheap hobby, a cheap pastime. The waiting list for allotments and councils is getting longer and longer. But as also the non-specialists really begin to enhance their offers, it actually broadens the appeal of gardening and actually sometimes makes it more accessible and also makes it cheaper. And it's particularly with Tesco, with Dobbies, for example, is actually making that far more competitive, bringing Dobbies products into Tesco stores. So looking at the DIY market in more detail, splitting that out. Well, it's not looking particularly rosy over the next few years. Average growth without the market actually contracting by 0.2%. Last year, again, of course, that was when it was really badly hit with a contraction of 1.4% as the bottom really fell out. The property market, unemployment was very high, and people just simply did not want to spend on anything housing related. The same is going to happen this year, really. The housing market is beginning to recover, showing some signs, but it's still pretty stagnant. But with very slow wage growth, higher taxes, higher living costs, people are cutting out spend everywhere, and one area to cut out very easily will be DIY. And again, we're not going to see a recovery until sort of 2013, and that's roughly when the property market is going to start getting much better, not only in terms of house prices, but also housing transactions. And housing transactions are normally the major stimulant of home improvements.